Hello, this is Professor Johnson, and this is another segment of Views from an HBCU economist. And so today, what I want to talk about price gouging and price ceilings. And so to start off, I want to start off with a question. Should we have price gouging laws? And so when you look at the 50 states, the large majority of them do have these laws in place. And then when you learn about what price gouging is, you understand why. Who wants to see excessively high prices right after disasters? And so, who wants to pay almost $100 for cleaning supplies or almost $300 for hand sanitizers? And that's typically sometimes what happens when and during vulnerable situations. And so, that's the reason why we have politicians in place and they respond. And so they're concerned about the inequity that takes place when this happens. We know the most vulnerable are impacted by this. Those who are living paycheck to paycheck cannot afford to pay such exorbitant prices. And so that's the reason why most states have in place laws that prevent businesses from raising prices too high. And when they do, they get fined. And so, in a sense, this acts like a price ceiling, which is what I want to talk about next. And so, I use the OpenStax textbook, Principles of Microeconomics. And so, we're going to click on to the online version, and I'm going to go to chapter 3, Demand and Supply. So, what I'm referencing here is in section 3.4, price ceilings. And so, I'm going to describe what price ceilings are. And so, when I describe it as a price control that attempts to prevent retailers from charging prices above a certain amount. And so this keeps prices lower, thus making it more affordable to consumers. And that's what politicians like. They want to keep voters happy. But here's the question. Is there a downside to that? Doesn't sound like there would be, but let's look and see. First thing we need to think about here is that when you have price controls, that can have an impact on market forces. So what I mean by that is this. Let's say a hurricane is getting ready to hit an area. Well, that's going to disrupt the supply chain. When hurricanes do significant damage to oil refineries, so then it becomes difficult to produce the oil necessary to make gasoline. Roads are impassable, so that can make it hard for trucks and delivery trucks and supplies to get to the stores. Then you have employees that might have trouble getting to their jobs. So all these factors play a role in making it harder for us to get the product on shelves. And so what we have here is a scenario where there's more scarcity, and more scarcity leads to higher prices. So let's look at this from the demand and supply perspective. And so here we have an upward sloping supply curve that refers to producers, sellers. And then we have a downward demand curve that refers to us as consumers. And so at a high price, $5, we're going to buy less, 300 gallons of gasoline at that price. And at $1 per gallon, we're going to buy more. As you can see, with 700 gallons. And the role is reversed for suppliers. Of course, if you can only charge a very low price of $1 per gallon, you're going to produce less gasoline, 300, than you would at a very high price of $6.50 per gallon, where you would produce 800 gallons. And so when we look at the market and when it's functioning properly, what we see here is that's going to take place when we have equilibrium. And so at this point where the demand curve and supply curve intersect, that's going to be where the equilibrium price of $3 will occur when quantity demanded and quantity supplied are both equal to 500. That's what happens when markets are functioning properly. Now, let's say there's an event that takes place. There's going to be a hurricane that's going to come in the next morning. So how do we respond the night before? Typically, people are going to go out and buy more gasoline the night before the storm. And so what that's going to do is that's going to increase demand. And we show that as a shift of the demand curve from the blue line to the gray line, which we're calling demand 2. And then what I want you to know here is the new equilibrium, which is the demand two and where it intersects the supply curve. And so what I want us to see is the equilibrium price will now rise to $4. And then we have a new equilibrium quantity that will also increase from 500 to 600 due to us buying more gas the night before the storm. Then let's assume the storm happens, and that's going to have an impact on the supply curve because, as I stated before, all refineries will be damaged. It's going to be difficult for suppliers to get gasoline to the gas stations. And so, what we're going to see here is a new supply curve, and it's going to shift over to the left. So, the orange supply curve line will now be replaced with a gold supply to line, and this is the new shift. And what I want you to see is where the supply to supply curve intersects the demand to demand curve. And so that is at a higher equilibrium price of $6. And at that $6, that's where quantity demanded and quantity supplied will be 400 gallons. So that's the equilibrium quantity. So quick summary here. We started at $3 before the storm. Then people started doing some panic buying, and that raises prices to $4. And then the storm hits, and then we have a significant decrease in supply. And so now prices rise to $6 a gallon, which is certainly something we want to avoid. So let me rewrite this demand and supply curve, and please note this demand two and supply two. And what I want you to notice here is where they intersect. It's at $6, which we said before. But now the government's making a response by setting a price control, a price ceiling. And what this is saying is telling these gas stations you cannot charge $6 a gallon, you're going to get fined. And so therefore gasoline stations will limit their increase to $4. And so that's where this blue line occurs. And what I want you to see here is that you're going to notice first, gasoline stations aren't going to produce what the market would want in this case, or what consumers would want at that price. They're only going to produce 200 gallons. And the reason why is because of what I talked about, disruption in the supply chain. That's going to raise the cost of producing gasoline. And so if it's going to cost them more than $4 a gallon to produce the gasoline, they're not going to produce more than 200. If producing more than 200 gallons of gasoline is going to cost them $4.50, $5, $5.50, they just will not supply gas at that because it would be cost prohibitive. And so, but the problem here at $4, you've got people wanting to buy 600 gallons of gasoline, but they're not able to get that because gas stations will not cooperate. And so therefore what we have here is a shortage, and the shortage is the difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And so 600 minus 200 is 400. And so what we have here is a scenario where people do not have gas. That's what we call an unintended consequence. And so here you think politicians trying to make voters happy, but nothing worse than going to a gas station and seeing no gas. Nothing worse than going to a grocery store trying to get bottled water that you're in need of and they're out of it. And so this is what happens when sometimes when government intervenes and then they impact the impact markets. And so in conclusion, what we're showing here is that sometimes government, what makes sense politically, can actually hurt you economically in the long run. And so, really, the story here is that we should allow markets to function freely because that's typically the best way to distribute resources. However, certainly we don't want to have to pay $6 a gallon for gasoline. So what are some other possible solutions? And so one thing I would suggest is to be proactive. And so one one way we can be proactive through state government is maybe having more emergency supplies in storage, buying additional gasoline before the storm happens so that they can distribute the gasoline to various gas stations, and that could maybe keep costs down a little bit. And then the other point here is that we need to encourage during storms that we shouldn't panic. That only buying more gasoline the night before the storm only makes things worse. And so that concludes price gouging and price ceilings and the impact that has on